Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Kokolis with Calibre CPA Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Cybersecurity and Your Bank, What You Need to Know. Today, we're pleased to have with us two renowned experts in the field of cybersecurity, Michael Kelly, Vice President and Information Security Officer for Truist Financial Corporation on the Corporate Security Cybersecurity team, and Thomas DeMayo, CISSP, CISA, and CIPP. A lot of initials there. He's very much an expert and a principal in the Cyber Risk Management Group of PKF O'Connor Davies. They'll provide valuable insights into the crucial aspects of cybersecurity within the banking industry. They'll cover topics like risk management, compliance, regulatory hurdles, and the implementation of effective cybersecurity practices. So before we get started, let me just give you a brief rundown of what's ahead today in our session. Following the presentation, we'll be hosting a Q&A session, so please feel free to submit any questions you might have. You can use the Q&A window at any point, and we'll do our best to address those at the end of the conference. For those that are seeking CPE or continuing professional education credits, please be on the lookout for polling questions that will appear at various times during the webinar. Answering these questions is necessary to meet the CPE credit requirements. And then after the webinar, we'll send you an email guiding you on accessing the program materials and also how to claim the 1 credit of CPE. So now please join me in welcoming our speakers. With a strong background spanning over 25 years in the financial services industry, Michael Kelly has excelled in various roles, including client security, authentication manager, and treasury management consultant. His expertise lies in aligning initiatives with organizational objectives, ensuring the protection of information assets and technologies. Mike has been instrumental in addressing complex challenges in vulnerability management, cyber threat intelligence, and governance, risk, and compliance, among others. Known for his commitment to educating clients and the wider community, Mike frequently shares his expertise through conferences, podcasts, and webinars, helping others to understand and mitigate the cybersecurity risks. Tom DeMayo is at the forefront of designing and implementing the PKF O'Connor Davies cybersecurity services, internal and external programs, and testing procedures. His expertise spans a wide variety of areas, including threat and vulnerability management, governance, privacy, incident response, business continuity, disaster recovery, and also computer forensics, with extensive experience across various industries such as commercial entities, hospitality, not-for-profit entities, governmental sectors, healthcare, educational institutions. Tom brings a wealth of knowledge in managing and securing information risks. He's also a skilled computer forensics specialist, adept in handling data acquisition and analysis in a forensically sound manner. He's also a recognized voice in the cybersecurity community, contributing to presentations and extensive writings on the subject. And I should mention also, he works closely with our internal IT department and IT director as an additional layer of cybersecurity and other resources. So please help me welcome Michael and Tom.
Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much, Jim, and to the Calibre team for putting this on and for having us. Looking forward to presenting with Tom. And we're going to get started with the agenda first, just to give everyone a high-level overview of the cybersecurity landscape. As we know, there's threats every day, and things change. There's new vulnerabilities, there's new threats. And so we're going to take a global view and look at what does the cyber landscape look like today and see how it's changing. Next item, we're going to talk about employees and staff, and that includes all of us, because ultimately we are the first line of defense when it comes to cybersecurity. Then we'll talk about internal processes and controls, some things you can do as an organization to really tighten up the controls. We'll talk about digital defenses, and this can relate really to the organization or also personally. What can you do from a personal standpoint to protect yourself? And then lastly, we'll talk about the strategy and how to partner with your financial institution to really put some of these controls in place. And then as Jim mentioned, there's a Q&A at the end, so you can put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll answer those towards the end of the program. So with that, let us talk about the top threat vectors. As I mentioned, some of these threat vectors change. This is kind of the latest that we've looked at and that we've seen from various threat intel. First one being compromised credentials. So think about the billions of records, billions of credentials, user IDs that have been compromised over the years. There's been over 12,000 breaches if you look at the stats. And again, billions of passwords that have been breached as a result. And so what we really try to drive home for consumers and organizations is to make sure that you're not using those same credentials and passwords in other applications. Bad actors are just taking those credentials, and we call it credential stuffing. They're just putting those into other applications to try to gain access. Ransomware, no doubt every week we're hearing about a new potential victim where their files are encrypted and when they're holding a lot of times client data for ransom. And so you'll hear a lot about this, obviously, continually throughout, and how that impacts third parties. So the third-party breaches really is what's kind of driving, I think, some of the issues from ransomware. When you look at third parties, think about not just the third party, but what about the fourth party? Who are their vendors? So you hear a lot about SolarWinds and Log4j and some of these vulnerabilities that have impacted multiple organizations. Next one is social engineering and phishing. So really just using the human element to trick someone in providing information, credentials, or whatever information they need to gain access. So it's probably the oldest form of when you look at fraud and threats, but it's effective. And then Internet of Things. So we call it IoT. When you look at the number of devices that we have, whether that is a refrigerator that has Wi-Fi or a coffee maker or Alexa, who's listening? Those devices, when you look at the numbers, there's about 15 billion devices. And so I know Tom can attest to this, that the network has now really expanded, right? How do you know what your threat network is and to manage those vulnerabilities if now you've got a list and number of IoT devices that are out there? And then the last one is employee errors or malicious insider. And so what if there's an employee that ends up sending an HR file? What type of controls are in place to make sure you've got data loss prevention controls so that email doesn't go out? Or when you look at an insider threat, those are hard to detect, but you really need to employ the concept of least privilege, which is to give the least amount of privileges for that individual, that staff member, to do their job. And now, Tom, if you want to talk a little bit about the global view of threats.
Sure. So looking at that middle circle there, I think one of the things that's important to kind of take into consideration, and it's a little bit eye-opening, if you look at the total loss, right, roughly 10.5 trillion, a lot of money, right? When you compare that to the total investment, well, the total investment is really a fraction of that loss. So I think that kind of puts into perspective, where the industry is. And yes, over time, we've seen that investment increase as businesses have kind of, I want to say, accepted that cybersecurity is an issue. It's not going to go away, and they've made those investments, but there is still room to go. If an incident does occur, and it's always, hindsight is 20/20, but you don't want to be in that position. If an incident does occur, it is incredibly expensive. By the time you factor in the forensics alone, the investigation, the potential downtime, right, the operational loss, that reputational impact, which is sometimes incredibly hard to quantify, it adds up very quickly. And when you think about where you're budgeting, I would say on average, there's two different metrics. You look at IT spend overall as a component of revenue, right? Typically you fall within, depends on the industry, you know, it can be 4% for a not-for-profit, 4.5% for a not-for-profit, up through 8 to 10% for a banking institution, financial services. Cybersecurity spend then on average, you know, is roughly 9 to 10% of that percentage of IT spend. You know, so it's still on the smaller side of what is being spent. And over time, you know, hopefully we'll see that start to balance, and hopefully there'll be smarter investments, and also too, I think we'll see where AI potentially plays into this, and if that helps also control some of the costs.
Great, thank you, Tom. So now we're going to take a view of really, when we look at the globe in terms of what's happening with cyber threats across the nations. And so when you look at the US, really what's happening, right? So we've got our networks that are potentially at risk. We've got critical systems, our entire infrastructure. So think about Colonial Pipeline, what happened to that, and how it just shut down, right? America drove up prices. You also have water systems, utilities that are at risk. And so there are organizations out there that work to partner to help have these discussions and share threat intel for things that are happening. A lot of those partnerships happen with federal authorities. So an organization called InfraGard, they share information between the FBI, and that's something that we belong to and share information to. But when you look at what's at risk, and then look at the potential threat vectors, when we look at the nation states, and we typically call these advanced persistent threats, so APTs for short. So when you look at the top nation states, what are they trying to do? A couple things. Cybersecurity comes down to really three pillars. One, confidentiality. How can they determine what that data is, right? How can they take the information and unencrypt it or use that data? So how can we keep that data secure? The next is integrity. Is how do you ensure that that data is actually accurate, that something has not been changed throughout the scope? And then lastly is availability. And what these bad actors are doing, nation states, are they're trying to destroy the availability of our systems. Some of which that they're doing through DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service. So if they can take down one system, now they've got a cyber war in place. And actually just this week, I was just reading about a couple things. So Iran was actually trying to gain access to a couple water facilities. China just employed their cyber army to also look at US critical infrastructure. And when you look at the geopolitical climate with Ukraine-Russia war, there's a lot of factors at place. And just more and more, we need to, as a country, protect our infrastructure and work together. So not just that, but you also have crime syndicates. And so I think most of us remember and hopefully didn't fall for, but the Nigerian prince, hopefully you all haven't seen the millions of dollars that they were promising. But when you look at the crime syndicates itself, Nigeria is really one of the biggest, I would say, countries in terms of where a lot of that money is funneled from and to. So we've got a lot of individuals who in the US have opened up accounts and in turn have funneled those dollars back to Nigeria. And thankfully, the FBI has been a big partner in trying to take down those crime rings. And they have really taken down hundreds of those rings itself. And Tom, anything to add from what you're seeing?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So, you know, looking at this, obviously, this is a very global, holistic perspective, and rightfully so, right? This is a global problem. But when you step back and you kind of think about how does this equate to me as an organization, you know, take a look at this, you take a look at the universe, and you start putting into perspective, right, relative to what do we do as a business, right? What is our adversarial risk, right? What is the likelihood that a nation state may target us based on whatever that might be? Or if you're supporting, say you're in the not-for-profit, you're supporting a specific cause that maybe not everyone in the world may necessarily agree with or is politically oriented. And you also start thinking about your data risk, right? How sensitive is the data, or how valuable is that data to you? Is it subject to where, you know, intellectual property in China may be enticed to try to get in and try to, you know, take that data? So take all this and again, put it in perspective relative to your organization, and that's going to become the basis of how really you're going to start to frame out what your cybersecurity program is going to be.
Right. Thank you, Tom. So everyone, if you notice, there is a poll. So if everyone can take a moment, and if you'd like to answer this question, according to Dashlane, the average internet user has how many online accounts that require a password? And I could probably say myself, I see my number potentially on here, pretty significant amount, I think, as we all look at this. So take a moment, and then we will go through the next portion. And then throughout, actually, we'll go through what some of these answers are too. So there's no test, I don't believe, at the end, as long as you're on here and answering the questions. All right. So in terms of what employees need to do, what can organizations do to inform their employees? Social media presence is a very important one. And when we look at this, really the threat actors are combing LinkedIn, they're combing social media. And so when new employees start, I've seen this before in other organizations, and just looking out, someone's happy about starting, they share their badge, right? What information are they sharing online? And so ensuring that that's in some of the policy and procedures of what can be shared and what shouldn't be shared. And then also encouraging them to have their privacy settings. Those are crucial. And I would also say, you know, when they're putting their job descriptions, and even from an HR standpoint, being very cautious about what systems are mentioned, right? So if that employee is working with an ERP system or a donor database, which in the past, some of those have been compromised, that just gives the bad actor a leg up. So they are using social media, they're creating new profiles, they're actually creating photos made from AI. I know Tom will probably talk about that a little bit. And they're befriending others. So once they have that network established, now they're trying to go after the individuals and the companies themselves. And to make it even easier, they have tools in their hands, which, you know, we've seen and used in a virtual environment called the Harvester, where they can just export data from organizations of the CEO, the CFO, who are the main stakeholders, and all that data is really out there. And Tom, if you want to talk about phishing and I should say ishings.
The ishings, yes, a lot of ishing. So stepping back a second too, you know, with the prior slide, that forms the basis. So when, say for example, attacker, or if it's us performing, you know, an external penetration test, you know, we're going to start with open source intelligence, right? We're going to scour the web, we're going to scour the profiles, and we're going to look to see what exactly is that presence, to what extent you're exposing yourselves, because that also then is potentially going to form the basis of our attack, which could very well be social engineering. So we may very well go to your company homepage on LinkedIn, and we may start to see who's associated, maybe looking for that intern or for that new employee that's all excited about joining the organization. You know, we know there's a good chance, one, they're younger, and two, they're newer to the organization. The level of training they have might not be as high, right? So that becomes a focal point for us to now say, well, let's pivot into that. All right. Now, when it comes to these issues, right? So we have phishing. Obviously, that's that email element. All right, that's been around the longest. You know, we've moved into what's effectively become smishing, right? That's the text messaging aspect of it. We have vishing, that's your voice aspect, all right? Those are the phone calls. And then, of course, we have now quishing, right? Quishing being the QR codes. Whenever we're thinking about social engineering, and if you look at statistics, a huge amount of time is targeted towards the individual, right? Getting to that person. And even as the attack landscape modifies and things become very sophisticated, like we're seeing with MFA bypass, getting past that, a lot of it still hinges on that individual, the training of that individual, getting them to the wrong page so that we can then further leverage our attack. When you're training your employees, right? Because that's going to be one of the key things, right? You're going to have to train them to do this. Part of that training is going to be getting them to control that emotional response. Understand that this is all an emotional game, right? They have to make that emotional hook with you, because if they don't make that emotional hook, well, you're not going to respond, right? You're not going to react to that bait that they're throwing at you. So it's getting them to control that emotional response, pause, inspecting, and thinking before they start doing any of these elements. And when it comes to things like vishing, making sure they're clear that things like phone calls, right? Caller ID can and will be spoofed. I'm sure many people on this call have gone that, where you see, and they like financial institutions. So you're going to see Citibank, you're going to see Bank of America, you're going to see these different things. I work with a credit union, so they were targeted, where they started reaching out to the members. And that number, sure enough, shows exactly like it should. That is, in fact, the known good number, but it's not them. And that's where the training has to really come into play, where, they have to know that is a possibility, and they have to know not to trust that caller ID, and they have to know they have to look and call back that known good number, right? Because while they could spoof the call coming in, they can't take control of the call going out. So half of it is about taking what's in their control, right? They're calling you, and you got to put it into your control on the outbound. Same thing with smishing, right? People have to understand that, yes, it's going to come in text messages, and it's going to be a link like no other else, or maybe they're going to try to get you to call a number, right? They're going to try to put it into their control.
Tom, you actually brought up a really good point around the smishing. And we as financial institutions really try to make it clear in our text messages back, if you get a one-time password, that we will not call you to collect your password, right? So there's an education component, but unfortunately, these bad actors are in between, right? So they're calling, acting like they are from the fraud department. So these are some things, again, we're just trying to make sure we get the message out to consumers, to organizations, to protect everyone. All right, so next, talk a little bit about password complexity and, most importantly, multi-factor authentication. And so back to the first slide, if you think about a couple of things. One, if our passwords are being captured due to compromises and exfiltration of data from companies, well, unfortunately, if those passwords are really complex, it really doesn't matter, because you're using those same passwords throughout. So this is important just from a fact of looking at, making sure it's complex on the front end, right? So if you are using, let's say, a password manager, which we do recommend, and making sure, it's a good choice and you've done your due diligence, making sure that password manager has a really strong password. And then within the password manager or key vault, now you've got really complex passwords through your hundreds. And I think the answer to the question was actually 240 password managers, or I should say passwords that individuals have to manage, right? Different sites, over 240 is what Dashlane mentioned. And so key ingredients is making sure that, and we use an example of a passphrase. So be present now. And good example, as we're looking, I'm sure, for the next poll, making sure we're if it's coming up or not. But when you look at this, how long does it take to crack that password? And Tom will attest to this. since he does a lot of the pen testing. But there are tools that we use. We actually use these in Capture the Flag events, where you can use a tool called Jack the Ripper, where you're basically just going in and brute forcing a password. And you'll see how easy it is to crack that. And then if you look at the more complex password with alphanumeric numbers, it certainly takes more time. But I think you're going to see as we progress, unfortunately, the technology is going to exceed the password complexity, meaning they're going to have even greater tools to crack these. So defense in depth is important, meaning multi-factor authentication on the front end will potentially mitigate someone having access or trying to gain access to your account. Anything else to add, Tom?
Yeah, putting in perspective, I mean, like Mike, like you said, we do a lot of the pen testing, and password cracking is part of our process, right? One way or another, whether we're just simply cracking passwords for an organization to kind of do a password analysis, or as part of the penetration testing process, we're getting access. But part of our process is going to be, just like there's the listing of passwords that have been compromised that are out there, sometimes associated to an individual, sometimes not. We're going to try to find those same passwords. And that's why it does become so important that you're not using the same password across accounts, because that is going to be their method, right? They're going to find what you've potentially used, and then they're going to use that across different accounts, especially if they could equate back to your personal email account as well. So if I could then, through that open source intelligence, figure out who you are for a company and then back that into who you are as a private person, I'm going to look for those too, right? And then I'm going to take that, tie that together, and that's going to form the basis of how I'm going to target you, especially if I start to see patterns. If you have multiple breach passwords out there, and they're fairly predictable in how you're developing them, because you're at password 1 for one site, but then you're at password 4 for the other, I kind of know where you're going, right? So I'm going to use that to my advantage. And when it comes to cracking those passwords, hackers and even us, we're not going to sit there and try every single possible combination. All right. It's too computationally intensive. What we're going to do is we're going to start with a dictionary, right? And that's going to become the basis of what we're going to use to attack. Now, that dictionary, well, yes, we have our own, but we're also going to pull from those known breach passwords because they give us a solid base. Once we get that dictionary, we're then going to put little algorithms in place where we know people change E's to a 3, zeros to an O, I's to a 1. They append the year, or they prepend certain numbers. We go through that process where then there's a good chance we're going to crack it. Now, obviously, if you start adding length, well, the dictionaries only do so much, right? The length is going to be your best friend, especially, if the system allows it, if you could put spaces into that process. If you could put multiple spaces, it's going to be very, very hard for us to crack, because our dictionaries just don't really account for it at this point, because a lot of people don't use it. So you want to keep that in mind. And even with multi-factor authentication, 3-4 years ago, you didn't see a tremendous amount of attacks on it. Nothing to the extent that you see now. They didn't have to, right? A lot of organizations didn't fully embrace it, but now pandemic, a lot of remote access, the insurance companies really stepped in. That's pretty much going to be a no-go if you don't have it, right? If you don't have remote access, they're not going to probably write you a policy. So the attackers had to evolve, right? Even now, where bypassing MFA, that is part of their tool set. Okay, whether they're going to try to get you to approve something where you didn't put the password in, but you inadvertently click, whether they're going to go after your SIM card, right? Whether they're going to try to port your number over because they know you're using text messaging to gain access to whatever that institution is, or they're going to hijack your session, all right? Where effectively they're going to put themselves between you and the legitimate site, pass everything through them, so that they don't really need your password or your multi-factor. All they need is that session. And once you've established, I have your session, well, now I'm in your account. That's going to go back to training, right? Because for me to even get that session, I got to get you to the wrong page first.
Yeah, these are great points, Tom. One thing I wanted to highlight, you mentioned the bypass. I think what we're seeing is MFA, or multi-factor authentication fatigue, right? You may have I think you kind of mentioned that, right? But I want to emphasize it because if they're constantly trying to get into the application and you're getting Google pop-ups and just, okay, I'm done. Now they're accessing the system. So that's been another tactic that they've employed. All right. Here comes your next poll. And so this is about the most lucrative data stolen by cyber criminals. So is it pension data? Now we have a lot of organizations, pension funds here. Is it healthcare data, financial data, or credit card data? So a few things to think about and answer. So hopefully everyone is present now. All right. And while we're waiting for that to finish, just making sure everyone has a chance. All right, looks like we're done. So this next slide is really back to internal controls. What are some controls that you can put in place as an organization? And I looked at a lot of the attendee lists that we received, and obviously a lot of finance teams and CFOs, controllers, etc. So a lot of these terms should be familiar. And as you can see, looking at the slide here, there are some solutions that financial institutions like us offer. So important, I always stress that, have these conversations with your bank about what solutions are out there. So to mitigate check fraud, there is payee name, positive pay, to ensure that you've got that one level of protection in place. And I'll talk a little bit about this in a subsequent slide, but some of the threats that we're seeing around that. And then, of course, putting in place segregation of duties, segregation of accounts. So maybe you have a disbursement account, a receivables account, making sure you've got those in place, and then the controls around them, who has access to those accounts, who has the privileges, back to that least privilege. And then there are solutions around putting blocks in place, whether it's through ACH, so that way you can tell the bank, hey, here's who can debit my account, and everyone else will be rejected. So pretty simple to look at some of the solutions. And I do want to have Tom mention real quick, because when we were talking about some solutions for organizations, this is something that I think Tom had a strong belief in, right? Positive pay.
Yeah. So, the nature of what I do, on the advisory side, I get called a lot, whether it's from my partners or from clients. Check fraud is incredibly common, right? It's just still very pervasive. And, the solutions are there. It's just that you have to embrace them, right? Specifically, positive pay, right? It really is one of those things that's been around for quite some time, but it is incredibly effective. You could start getting into, well, we want maybe more advanced paper checks, and we're going to try to do different things on that end. But, with positive pay, it becomes, almost very, very difficult to get around, right? Especially if you're tying it in, not just to the number, right? The amount of the check, but if you're tying it into the payee, which that's important. A lot of times, I have been called, especially over the past year, where the organization has embraced positive pay, but they didn't tie it to the payee name. And of course, because that wasn't tied to the payee name, well, then you can start washing checks, right? You'll see that in the subsequent slide, which has become a problem. And sometimes too, what I see with organizations is, well, they say positive pay is just too onerous, especially if they're smaller, right? They feel they don't want to go through that process, which, again, I say most softwares have kind of built it where they can kind of export the files pretty easily. The banks have made it pretty simple to get to their portal to upload. Sometimes it's even automated, depending on your system. But if you are small and you do, in fact, don't have a lot of checks, because again, that's an argument that I hear sometimes too as to why they don't do it, then you can start looking at other forms of positive pay, right? You can look at reverse positive pay, where you're not necessarily giving the bank the file, but they're informing you what's coming in, and then you have to make a position on whether or not you're going to let it go or not. And if you're not doing checks, well, then you should block it, right? That's where a check block comes into play, right? All these options are available, but you got to work with your bank to set it up. All right. And once you put these in, like I said, they have a balance of controls to fit your work style so that it's not onerous, but at the same time, it's going to mitigate the risk. Right. So you really do want to embrace what's there, because unfortunately, it's easy to say you don't need it until it happens. Right. And then these are the first set of controls everyone's going to tell you to put in.
Yep. Well said, Tom. That's exactly the conversations we typically have with clients, right? It's making sure that partnership is there. Here's the tools we offer, and clients leveraging those tools to protect themselves too. So, all right. So why are we stressing positive pay with payee name? One of the biggest threats, and this actually came up prior to the webinar in some of the topics that Calibre wanted to cover, that they thought was important, of course, and we do too. So when you look at this was a recent advisory from the USPS and Postal Inspector Service that they put on check fraud. And so you obviously know it's important when there's a video. So everyone will get the slides, and glad to provide any of the material. But ultimately, this is something they had to put out due to the sheer volume of check fraud that has been happening really for a while. I mean, I think even prior to the pandemic, it's been high, but I think even more so after the pandemic. And what we've seen is on the dark web, actually able to pull some photos and pictures, videos. And one of the things that they're doing is they're purchasing the arrow key. So they have full access to the mailbox, and essentially taking a stack of checks and using the tools, which actually they've had the check washing tools, gosh, back in the 60s. So the technology has just gotten that much better. And then they're just opening accounts and then using those checks, washing the name off of the check, and then putting on whatever name, whatever identity that they've potentially stolen, or a new entity that they've opened. Maybe they've opened up a business served for those purposes. So again, this is really something that's important. There is an advisory that was out there through FinCEN, who manages a lot of the financial regulatory bodies. So just a couple of things we wanted to highlight regarding this topic. And now we're going to talk about business email or vendor email compromise, which I think is probably the most prevalent right now in terms of vendor email compromise. And when you look at the numbers, so we talked about ransomware, business email compromise in terms of dollars of losses is significantly more than a ransomware. Now, ransomware payments, you may hear 2-3 million, maybe more, but there's been email compromises in the millions. And when I say millions, 60 million. You can go Google the term and you'll find a lot of organizations, unfortunately, that have been impacted. And so the FBI has been keeping track through their IC3 report, which is the Internet Crime Complaint Center, where you go to report this information, by the way. And so the latest stats that they've carried since 2013 until last year was 50 billion. So pretty staggering number. No doubt, I'm sure everyone on the call have seen something very similar to this, perhaps coming from their leadership, their CFO, CEO. So I'm not showing you anything new here, but you can see how easy it is, perhaps looking at the accounting at vendor.com, that perhaps it was a spoofed email, right? Or a new email that they set up, just changing the I to an L. And so while that's something to look out for, and back to the phishing training, also they've got account information, right? Typically that they're attaching. And so it may be an invoice. couple things we've seen recently, and this is actually a real life example, working with an organization, but their vendor's email was actually compromised. So unfortunately, the bad actor was on the inside reviewing emails. They were changing email rules. So as emails would come in, they would shift those over to a folder. As emails went out, they would delete those, right? And so they noticed invoices that were coming in. They had access to all that information. And so when they got the invoice, they actually went through and created a PDF very similar and just changed the routing number and account number instructions. And then, of course, emailed that back out. And unfortunately, that organization made the payment. And so it's happening so frequently, unfortunately. And this goes back to controls that we'll, I'm sure, talk even more about, but verifying with that vendor, and I'll stress it, I know Tom will say it, but ensure that you have those conversations so that if anything changes, you're on the phone with that vendor, taking it out of band, right? So go out of text messages, go out of email, and just call that vendor. Have some processes in place for that. And then the threats are getting even, I would say, slicker. So Tom, if you want to cover what you're seeing or what we're seeing, I think it is an industry.
Yeah. So, one of the things that, we talk about the callback process, which is critical. One, obviously, you don't follow the number in the email. You got to go back to your known good record. But you got to establish all that information up front, right? So you have that known good record. You know who to call. You know who's authorized on the other side to communicate with, when it comes to those numbers. But part of what we're seeing is a shift too, where they know you're going to call back, right? They know a lot of organizations have embraced that process. So what do? Well, that's where spoofing of the caller ID comes into play. And they might try to get ahead of that callback by calling you from that company's number. All right. So yes, it's going to show up. They're going to call. They're going to say, hey, I just sent you that email. I want to make sure you got it. You want to review the numbers or whatever the case might be. They're trying to break the process. All right. So you get a sense of comfort. You kind of did that check, right? But they're still in control. You always have to have that ability to kind of disconnect and call back that known good number. Now, where it's going to become more complicated, right? Especially in I would say over the next year, especially as organizations try to catch up. AI, when it comes to that deep fake, that emulation, whether it's voice, image, things that we've come known to trust, we're not going to be able to trust it the way we used to. All right. And that could be even too, where, if you're a CEO or a CFO, if they can get enough of a sample of their voice, well, they're going to be able to emulate it, right? Which means that they could very well call as that person and try to get money out the door, which means that as part of what you're doing internally, you got to kind of have to get ahead of that and make sure your staff, anyone that's involved with that payment process, they're empowered to even question the CEO and disconnect from the CEO or the CFO and call back that known good number. As much as their response might be, I want to accommodate and, I don't want to, disconnect from the CEO or the CFO, you have to empower them to do that because that is the process, right? Otherwise, money will inevitably move. I think next year is going to be pretty bad when it comes to business email compromise as AI aggressively moves into the space.
Yeah. Great points, Tom.
When it comes to, mitigating these things, and we talked about the callback, but there's other things you want to have, obviously in play. One of the things is, you have to have that separate initiator and approver, right? That is absolutely critical. You don't want one person to have complete control of the process. And even if you're small, you want to figure out, maybe it's with one of the board members or whatever it might be, to break that up, especially when you start looking at some of these attack vectors where, look, we know MFA can be bypassed. If they can get into one account and that account has complete control over the movement of money, well, the money's going to move, right? But if you split that across two, yes, it's a good internal control because now you have a second set of eyes before that money does move. But at the same time, you now make it where they have to effectively get to two accounts within a relatively short time span, which is incredibly unlikely, right? That is incredibly difficult. Typically that's not going to happen. Okay. Setting up those vendors, getting all the information about them, training the staff, even if you have the policy, They have to know they have to follow the policy. Because yes, a lot of companies have embraced the callback, but sometimes what we see is, yes, it's written in policy, but the employee just didn't follow it. So that continual education, that reinforcement, and if you have those basic controls in play, the separation of initiator and approver, the multi-factor is in play, you have the callback numbers on file, they know to always call back, you're going to be in a very good position. It's when those controls break down or you don't put them into play that, again, inevitably money will move. When it comes to setting up your defenses, this is where, you want to, obviously you think about your 5 pillars, right? Sort of the NIST framework. You have to identify, you have to protect, you have to detect, respond, recover, right? That's everything you want to think about. When we think about these digital defenses, we're kind of in the identification and the protection phase, right? Looking at your firewalls, making sure that what is coming through is what should be coming through, and making sure that, you're even patching those firewalls as well. Over the past year, a lot of the ways the cyber criminals have gotten in is because of a vulnerability within the firewall. Take your rules out of the equation, the firewall was simply vulnerable, right? So then they came through, that mechanism. You have to know your data, right? And put in solutions where if it is in fact sensitive, yes, you want to train people to do certain things like encrypt it, but should they not do it, well, then that's where technologies come into play that will identify it and will enforce it, all right? And encrypt, whether it's a laptop, whether it's a USB drive, you have to get your arms around that and not just assume it's in play. You want to have all those detective controls to identify if that one laptop made it out of assembly or out into production, but somebody missed that key step, right? So you have to not only think about how do we get it in, but then how do we detect when that control fails, right? Limit your access, right? Who's getting access to what, especially when you start thinking about what devices they're connecting from. You don't want people necessarily connecting remotely to your cloud-based system that might have sensitive data in it because they can, but they're not using the device that you provided. So all those security controls that you put into play and all that investment that you made and all that next generation antivirus and all those great things, well, that goes to the wayside because now they're using a device that, well, you don't control. All right, so you have to get your arms around that. You got to embrace multi-factor consistently. If it's a remotely accessible system and that system poses any risk to you in some form, you got to protect it with multi-factor. Is it bypassable? Sure. But again, it's a layer that you don't want to not have in play. And then, of course, you got to back up. All right. You got to make sure you have the backup, you test the backup, you could restore all these different things, because if you do get subject to a ransomware type event, your ability to recover could be a key differentiator between whether you pay or not. If you're completely down and you have no backups, there's a highly good chance you're going to end up having to pay.
Yeah, it reminds me, of defense in depth, right? Kind of what we're trying to get across is if you secure your home, you have a lock on the door, maybe you have a keychain lock, maybe you've got alarm system, got cameras. So they may be able to bypass one of those, but having multiple layers is really the key. So Internet of Things, I mentioned IoT and the number of devices, being 15 billion. I also read that that's probably going to double in the next few years. So we're looking at 30 billion, if not more. And so the perimeter, as I mentioned, has now expanded beyond just what we can control as an organization and even what we can control as a consumer. So I always, mention, hey, who's listening? If you have a device at home, I don't have any, being in this industry and a little bit more paranoid. But if you have an Alexa device or something that's listening, especially if you're working remotely, you have to kind of think about that from an employer standpoint. What am I talking about? And then even for privacy purposes. A good example was a story. Someone actually requested all of their information from Amazon. Hey, I have a privacy policy. Can you send me whatever was recorded? And so they got back thousands of hours, which was fairly scary when you think about this and all the conversations and everything else that was captured on there. So again, back to the company and and having these things, making sure as an employee that you're abiding by those if you're working remote. We talked about password strength, but I think home routers, with the pandemic, everyone moving and shifting home. I'm sure Tom lived through that experience. Was, I'm sure, not too fun, shifting everyone back to, again, laptops and the VPN. But for the most part, I think that's another threat vector, is how many individuals, which you can't control, actually have gone in and changed their default router, right? What's the password? Because the bad actor, what Tom mentioned, using open source intelligence, can Google a Cisco router and find out what the admin password is. Pretty simple. And then mobile device protection. I know a lot of organizations have bring your own device or BYOD or some sort of mobile management program. So it's really just a matter of what works best for your employees. And in terms of, making sure, do you have a containerized system? So if they want to use their personal phone, can you put your company's organizational information, email, et cetera, Teams, and have it containerized and then shut down in the event that something were to happen? All right.
All right. So,
Someone's calling from IT, Tom. Hang on.
all right. So share with IT, right? Should you ever share your password even with IT if they call? All right. Yes or no? Right. So I'll kind of combine 1, 4, and 5 in kind of one fell swoop. So, things will happen, right? It's inevitable. You can have the best defensive mechanisms in place. Something will inevitably at some point go wrong. This is where your resiliency is going to come into play, right? This is where you have to, one, predict. You have to prepare for what exactly might happen, and that's part of having a plan and a process in play. Again, I think the pandemic kind of showed us we need to be resilient, right? We need to kind of forecast what could happen and have that plan into play, which, from the cyber realm, it's having your incident response plan, and then it's having your business continuity / disaster recovery. They come together, right? They're not, you don't want to think of these things as their own, components. They do intersect. If you have a major ransomware event and all your systems are down, that's going to become a business continuity issue, right? You're going to have to enact other plans, but you have to really know what to do when that happens. Or even if money goes out the door, if money does get dispersed, time is of the essence. If you want to get that money back, the longer you wait, the less likely that's going to be, right? Or the harder it's going to be. That should be baked into your incident response plan. Did we contact the bank? Did we put in a report into IC3? What exactly do we have to do? You want all that mapped out well in advance. And then it's great to have a plan, but if nobody knows what the plan is or what their role is, well, the plan's not going to be all that effective. All right. This is where then tabletop exercises come into play and making sure people understand their roles, what the plan is, again, their responsibilities, not just from a, IT side, but also looping in, your executives and your C-suite, HR, all the different members of the team, so that they know that they themselves, what exactly they have to do.
Yeah, and I'll try to consolidate. I think we talked about, 2, 3, 6, and 7. So when I look at this, what are the crown jewels? So each organization's different, right? Whether you're a healthcare company, pension organization, accounting firm, a bank, you name it, right? Each one has the crown jewels of data. So those are the things you need to protect. And by the way, back to that poll question, what's the most lucrative data? And it is healthcare, if you've guessed that, right? It goes for thousands of dollars versus maybe a credit card is potentially, less than $1. So knowing the crown jewels, putting controls around those crown jewels, whether data is in transit, right, through email, or data is being uploaded through a Dropbox, or, really data at rest. How do you encrypt that data? And then making sure that you tag the data so you know where it is and what it is. And then applying a business lens. This is kind of in my day-to-day job. So we can put all of these controls in place, put all of these layers, but at the end of the day, if the business can't get the job done and bring in revenue or whatever it may be for your organization, take care of constituents, then we have a problem. And so that's why it's important to work with your security teams and for your security teams to understand what is the business impact. Because at the end of the day, Tom and I talk about this a lot. A lot of these are business decisions. And so you have to keep that in mind. And then in terms of security, everyone's responsibility, that is something that we've talked a lot about. Obviously, it's not just the security folks, it's everyone within. And then FBI contacting partners if something were to happen. I think we talked about ic3.gov. And going to the last couple slides here. So this is just an overview of what we offer at Truist. And so I know there may be organizations working with your financial institution, whoever that may be. So the most important part of this is having your conversation with the banker, with the treasury officer, with that team who's really in the middle. And so they can talk to you about the solutions we talked about, right? Whether it's check block, whether it's putting positive pay in place with pay name, whether it's having ACH filters, or even our organization, we do have a cyber insurance arm. So we have McGriff Insurance that can talk to our clients about cyber insurance, which is an important topic too. And then finally, this is just an overview of what we do. You know, we are one of the largest financial institutions, top 10 banks. We have a strong board. We have a chief information security officer that has been in the industry for many years, worked at Boeing, at NASA, has a ton of experience, has really delivered, I think, for our culture across the bank, ensuring that cyber is number one. And so we have day-to-day conversations with our industry trade partners, which is the ISACs. We call them Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, hence the term ISAC to make it a lot easier. But ultimately, organizations can partner with an ISAC to share intel. So maybe there's a malware variant, maybe there's a phishing email. All this is real time, and we try to share that information to protect. And then just to sum it up, so we did establish a cybersecurity champion program, which is really successful. And we recommend organizations do the same, where you have a champion, so a subject matter expert, may not be in cyber or security, but they can kind of raise awareness, train the trainer, and you spread that throughout the organization. And then just kind of a couple other bullets I just want to highlight. Yes, we've got thousands of teammates in cybersecurity, so underneath our organization. We have a 24/7 cyber operations group, our SOC, that's looking at client information, making sure that's protected in addition to our networks. And so all of these things are important. And then the last thing is the education. And that's really what we're doing today. And that's what we want to make sure our clients are educated so that they can empower themselves. So with that, I think we are at the Q&A.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael and Tom. It's really great information for all of us. So let's go ahead and move into our Q&A session. I'll pull the questions, and both Mike or Tom, please feel free to respond. The first item, somebody was asking if attendees will receive a copy of the presentation after the session. And how to do that. And yeah, absolutely. Post webinar, there'll be an email which you can look out for, which details how to access the program materials and also how to request the 1 credit of CBE, CBE educational credit. So the next question, I'll just jump into this. What should companies be doing or thinking about as it relates to AI?
Sure. So I'll take that one. So when it comes to AI, I think the first thing is, you as an organization, as a company, you have to either, put in a policy, and you kind of have to take a position on what you're going to do with it. And part of that policy is going to be that education to employees to really know what the risk is and what your expectations are of them. Policy wise, I think you want to get ahead of can employees use it? If they can use it, into what capacity can they use it? Making sure they know that they can never put any type of sensitive data within these open AI engines and those types of things, because obviously now they're going to expose that to the training models and to the data sets that are being used. And also, even as a company, you want to know the use cases, because people will get pretty creative. As I'm dealing more and more clients, employees get very creative with how to use it, and you start seeing things that you never would have thought of, but they're using it. So I think part of that is having a little bit of a stopgap where you're not saying no, but they have to come and they have to kind of let you know what exactly they want to do, and then you make a decision on whether or not you're going to allow it or how you're going to control it. And you just kind of keep building off that as this plays out, and we start to really figure out, where AI is going to fit into the equation.
Great, thanks, Tom. The next question is, what seems to be the most effective phishing lure that generates the highest click rate?
I could probably take this. In looking at some of the, overall what's worked, I think for organizations as we've done phish tests, I would say return to work is a really big one, right? Everyone gets the email. And then actually, interesting enough, dress code. It is pretty high click rate for organizations. I'm not talking about ours. I'm talking about in general when you look at click rates. So how about you, Tom? What do you see?
Yeah, relatively the same. Especially if we're doing phishing exercises, we're gonna try to hit those pain points, those things where we know, employees are gonna have that knee-jerk reaction because they want to see what it is. Of recent, we've been giving away merchandise, so we make them think that the company's, for the holidays is, here's a free T-shirt, here's a free tote bag, and they have to fill out the survey to to claim their prize. So,
Yeah, great, thank you. Next question: how often should companies be performing cyber risk assessments or activities such as penetration testing?
Sure, I'll take this one. So, when it comes to doing the risk assessments, again, always equate it to the risk of your business. If you're a small nonprofit, you don't really have a lot of data risk, you don't need to do these things every year, right? You do it on somewhat of a basis. I wouldn't exceed 3 years at that point. If you have sensitive data, and you have more dependency on IT, or you're transactionally dependent for your revenue, there you really want to start thinking about it's more of a yearly cadence. Right. And then even, not just the risk assessments, but then that's where the penetration testing comes into play, to make sure that there is nothing gaping, that you're responding correctly, the tools are stopping what they should be doing. And again, someone can't find their path into your environment, and then, a bigger issue comes into play.
Got it. All right, thank you. We have another question here. Are you worried about quantum computing and the possibility of current cryptography being compromised?
Yeah, I'll say, I know Tom, I'm sure, has some really good comments on this, but I've been to a lot of conferences recently, a lot of organizations, whether it's the NSA that's talking about this, but ultimately, Tom mentioned the NIST guidelines, so National Institute of Standards and Technology. And so they are actually working very hard and fast to work through these quantum challenges, which is going to change the landscape, right? If they're able to crack current encryption algorithms in seconds, if not quicker. So I think there's a whole industry focus right now. I know a lot of dialogue on this, but Tom, any thoughts from you?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, if it does get to that point, and we're not ahead of it, that's going to be significant. All of our security, whether it's in transit, at rest, depends on this encryption. If something could reverse that, well, then it goes for naught. And then even if you think about cryptocurrency, well, that whole model gets destroyed, because that's all built on, our standard encryption mechanisms, right? Public-private key pairs. money would move very quickly if that gets if that actually happens.
Great, thank you. And it looks like the final question that we have is a majority of organizations conduct phishing training, but how about voice phishing or even text SMS phishing?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, and Tom and I, this was actually a good question I sent to Tom just to pick his brain on it. But yes, we definitely conduct phishing in addition to vishing. I think some of the challenges organizations may face, though, maybe around the SMS challenges, right? Whether it's with text messages and whose phone. So Tom, you actually had mentioned some of the challenges I think that organizations may face.
Yeah. So I mean, when it comes to, you know, the text messaging aspect, or even potentially the phone calls,
yeah,
you know, if the company doesn't own that phone and that number, you really can't the employee is not authorizing you to conduct a test against them in that capacity. You know, it's kind of like if we do a penetration test against the network, that company has to own that space that we're going to target. Otherwise, it's no go. Right, and that's the same thing with BYOD so prevalent. It makes it hard for a company to legitimately do that because they don't own the numbers. So it's a little bit of a, you know, it's a little bit of a hard area to test. You know, and even with that too, I mean, depending on your business, that's where even physical penetration testing and that type of aspect comes into play. You know, and they want to think about that. You know, can somebody talk their way into the building to get access? I mean, we have one that's going on today, you know, where it's for a medical institution. You know, so we're doing the pre-texting, we're calling, letting them know that there's somebody coming, who's coming, there's a problem with the key management system. And then sure enough, that person's going to show up and try to get their way into the building. So all these different mechanisms.
Yep.
It works.
Well, Mike and Tom, thank you again for your time and your expertise today. This is very valuable information and very much appreciated. So that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you for joining us. And please look again for the email which details how to access the program materials and request the 1 CPE credit. We hope you find this sessions valuable and hope to see you at our next event. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.